Weak and lost. He looked so weak. Those were the only words my grieving, frightened mind could think. He looked so weak, he shouldn't be here. He sat alone, across from me, while the two women held each other and cried. He sat alone, weak and ill and grieving. Fighting back my tears and fear, I crossed the floor to sit next to him, pulling his weak hand into mine. He squeezed my fingers gently and turned to me with a pain-riddled grin, while his own tears flooded those dark brown eyes. "Let me take you home," I said. Heavy tears rolled down our cheeks at precisely the same moment. He breathed a deep sigh, glanced at the women, turned back to me and nodded. He looked so weak, I thought, and reminded myself to stay strong. I walked over to the women, those two sisters whose mutual pain, I was sure, was the only thing anyone in the waiting room could hear, see, or feel. I squatted down in front of their chairs, swallowing back my tears, and grasped their interlocked hands for strength. Lost was the word that entered my mind. Yes, her mother looked lost, and scared. Tears streamed down my face, despite my efforts to staunch the flow. My tears streamed while a sob escaped my throat. They each lifted free hands and clasped my shoulders, which I found the strength to square in the wake of our shared pain. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and then faced the fear of looking into their beautiful, grieving faces. "Is it okay if I bring Mr. Charlie home? There's nothing more he can do here." I stuttered out this plea between stifled sobs. Jane's mother nodded, flashing me a brief, grateful grin. She lifted her hand from my shoulder, while her sister's hand remained. She lifted her hand to cup my cheek. She caressed my face and whispered, "Thank you, my dear. I am so grateful you are here. Yes, please take him home. Gerda and I will be there shortly." She removed her hand, then she kissed the tear-soaked cheek, which was warm from her touch. I reached over to hug her, as well as her sister. I hugged them both while marveling at the love that was still so present in such a lost soul. I rose to my feet, unsteady and shaken. I arose, closed my eyes, and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I re-squared my shoulders, swallowed back more tears, and turned to face the weakness that was hunched over in his chair. His eyes, aimed at the floor, lifted as he registered my approaching feet. He too arose, shaken and unsteady. I reached out to help him as the word "weak" flashed through my mind yet again. We walked slowly toward the women, arm in arm, with shuffling feet. He leaned over and kissed his wife gently. All four of us cried anew. His sister-in-law stood up to hug him, then she hugged me once more. We left the women in their grief as our shuffling feet headed toward the exit. We walked arm in arm all the way to the car. As I reached out to open his door, he placed a hand on mine, and I paused. I looked up into his tired, crying eyes and felt his hand shaking. In a weak, breathless voice, he choked out words of love. "Thank you for being here, Lily. Thank you from me, from Anna, from Jane." He began to sob as he stammered over the last name, and my sobs quickly joined his. We held each other in the parking lot, amidst the glare of the light from the poles, surrounded by the sounds of squealing brakes and slamming doors, under the star-strewn sky. We held each other and cried. Time seemed to stand still in that moment, as though it had slammed down on its own squealing brakes. Time stood still, a spotlight seemed to have captured us in its glare, and nothing else mattered but the fact that we were there to comfort one another in this shared pain. I drove him home in silence, a silence only broken by the sounds of sniffling and choked sobs. He patted my shoulder occasionally, and a few times I reached over to squeeze his hand. When I pulled into the family's driveway and killed the engine, we sat in darkness. We sat in silence. There was comfort in that silence, and, of course, there was pain. I squeezed his hand once more and heard him sigh. We reached for our door handles at the same time. He exited the car so slowly, so weakly, that I was quickly by his side to help him to his feet. I wrapped an arm around him, and we shuffled toward the front door. He led us into the house and straight to his chair. As he eased himself into the seat with a groan, I could not help but think of how weak and frail he seemed. I lowered my eyes to hide an upsurge of tears and began to turn away, when he reached out and grabbed my hand. As I looked into his dark brown eyes, shot through with redness and full of tears, he whispered, "She's gone." My knees buckled beneath me and I sunk down to the floor. We were both doubled over with painful sobs, my entire body shaking by his feet. Both of our bodies shook with uncontrollable grief, yet our hands remained clasped together. "Yes, she's gone." I echoed his words, without realizing they would be the last he would speak for several hours. Again, time seemed to freeze. In the soft glow of a lamp, on the cushy surface of shag carpeting, with his warm hand pressed against mine, I cried and sobbed for the life we had lost. I cried for the loving presence we would never feel again. I cried for the pain all of us felt. I cried for the weakness I saw in this amazing man. I cried for how lost his wife appeared. I cried for the strength I knew I had to find, the strength I needed in order to face this loss with them, and without her. I do not know how long we sat there, crying and hurting and holding hands. I do not know how long we sat there, but I knew that moment would never leave me. Sometime later, we heard a car pull into the driveway and 2 doors slammed shut. I dried my eyes and found an inner reserve of strength, preparing myself to greet the grieving sisters. I squeezed his hand again and got back to my feet. I watched him reach a shaking hand into his pocket to pull out a cloth handkerchief. That white piece of fabric, in the weak hands of a man whom I had always viewed as incredibly strong, brought back flashing images of my own father. I saw an image of my father, strong and laughing, stuffing a white handkerchief into his pocket. I recalled him weak and frail, fighting to regain lost memory and lost functioning, pulling a handkerchief from that same place. My tears returned, old grief on top of new. Jane's mother Anna entered first, her eyes darting around the room, not landing anywhere for very long. Her eyes were as lost as their owner seemed to be. Her sister crossed the threshold, a new strength and resolve in her step, until those steps faltered, as she glanced at Jane's father in his chair, weakly mopping his face with that piece of white cloth. The cavalry was arriving, a cavalry of family, full of love and hugs and tears and pain. As aunts, uncles, cousins, distant relatives, and the rabbi arrived, the weak man in his chair said nothing, and only moved when he had to return a hug. The lost woman wandered from room to room, from person to person, choking out words between sobs, constantly running her hands through her hair. Each time I began to feel like an intruder in the midst of the family's grief. Someone would grasp my hand or hug me and thank me for being there. I wanted to run away. I wanted to run and scream and cry. But love rooted me to the spot on the couch where I held Mr. Charlie's hand for the long hours of his grief-laden silence. The night passed in a blur, and the amount of bodies in the house began to dwindle. From the tears, the pain, and the heavy burden of the day, I was having a difficult time propping my eyes open. I was on the verge of releasing the weak hand I had held in mine for countless hours, when Miss Anna entered the room and seated herself next to me on the couch. She clasped my other hand in both of hers, kissed me on the cheek, and stated, "I am so glad you are with us. You will stay the weekend, right?" I nodded numbly, while I stared into her lost, red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you," she added. "Sleep in Jane's room, okay?" My eyes widened, and I felt the air whoosh out of me. How could I sleep in her room, knowing she was gone forever? How could her mother want me in there? Wasn't I intruding enough? My mind ran in circles, spiraling out of control with frightened question after worried thought. I began to protest, mumbling something incoherent and jumbled, but she silenced me with a smile. "Please," she said simply. My eyes betrayed my nagging worries, and she continued, "I cannot contemplate Jane's room being empty tonight, and I would love for you, who is like another daughter to me, to sleep in my daughter's bedroom." She smiled again, while tears pooled in her eyes. I nodded and took a deep breath. How can I deny such a request, I thought. She thanked me, hugged me, and slowly wandered out of the room. Mr. Charlie never moved. He sat, silent and motionless, staring at the wall and holding my hand. I stood up, still holding his hand, and squatted down in front of his chair. His eyes roamed away from the wall to peer down at my face. I reminded myself to breathe, in spite of what felt like a kick to the chest, when I saw the full extent of the pain in his eyes. We remained there, looking into each other's faces, while my mind searched for the words I'd meant to say. I took a deep breath and asked him if he wanted me to walk him upstairs. He closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. The weakness of his response overwhelmed me with fear. "Are you sure, Mr. Charlie? I'm going up to bed right now." I ceased speaking as he continued that slow shake of his head. I told him good night as I got up to hug him. I told him good night while fighting the fear in my voice. He squeezed my hand once more before releasing it, and I suddenly felt very empty. My solo procession up the stairs toward that lonely, terrifying room was slow and halting. I almost collapsed halfway up them when I began to cry silent but violent tears in remembering Jane and her smile on those very stairs. I remembered her boundless energy, her beautiful face, her inescapable love, as she had once run down the stairs to greet me. I remembered her, and remembered she was gone. Holding on to the banister, I pulled myself forward, pulled my mind away from painful memory. I paused at her door with my hand on the knob. I paused and breathed deeply, letting the tears continue to flow. I opened the door with a creak and stared in at the darkness, at the emptiness. As I turned on the light, I breathed again. The room was not empty. She was everywhere within it. She was in the pictures scattered around the walls and tables. She was in charcoal sketches and watercolor paintings hung throughout the room. She was in the large stack of music, in the volumes of books on a shelf, in the post-it notes stuck to her mirror, laden with quotes which had made her smile. I breathed and smiled and cried. I breathed her life into mine. I smiled for the love we had shared. I cried for the memories that remained. As I slowly wandered around her room, running my hands over the spines of books, gazing at photographs, reading those quotes, I realized that I was also in this room. I had been in this room for years. I smiled again. There was a picture of Jane and me, laughing, with our arms around each other. On her dresser was a snapshot she had taken of me singing her favorite song at karaoke, sharing a frame with a photograph of us on stage together. Her nightstand held an image of my dog licking her face while she laughed. I was in the books I had recommended. I was in the music. I was in the watercolor painting of a sunset. I began to read the posted quotes and saw that I was there too. Some I had read to her or texted to her, and one was spoken by me. At the top of this haphazard spray of color, of her beautiful handwritten words, was a pink post-it. She had drawn a large heart at the bottom of the note. It read, "You wear the smile that keeps me going, a smile that is always full of love. Megan Lely McLaughlin." I lost my breath and clutched my chest, overwhelmed and amazed, weak and lost. I remembered speaking those words, words I never imagined would end up on a mirror of wisdom. They had been spoken over held hands at a spontaneous brunch, when everything had been falling down around me, when I had felt completely lost and overcome with weakness. She had been my strength and helped me find my way back to laughter that morning. Those words were spoken with tears in my eyes. Those words were uttered to a loving, smiling face. Her smile returned to my mind in that moment, and I laughed through my tears. I placed my palm on the post-it, which captured the love we had shared. I placed my palm on her careful writing and felt strong. I had found her once, and because of that, I knew I would never truly be lost.